I normally really enjoy Derek's content on the Veritasium YouTube channel, but his recent video about experts disappointed me a little bit. As an educational scientist, expertise, practice, and related scientific areas fill up much of my research time. So here is a different perspective on becoming an expert. The video starts with someone learning lots of numbers of pi. Very impressive. And Derek goes on to briefly discuss a theoretical approach to thinking, which he covered in a previous video. The reason I emphasize theoretical is because the terms used don't have unified definitions or absolute proof that that is how we think and therefore learn. The theory is briefly explored in Magnus Carlsen's memory of popular chess positions. So they weren't random positions, they were games played at a high level. It was similar to asking a football commentator about a Premier League game. Not a random Sunday league game, a Premier League game. There were constraints on the games showed. Magnus needed help on a game that was referenced from Harry Potter because it wasn't a game he was that familiar with. Derek goes on to say,
"The data are clear. Chess experts don't have better memory in general, but they have better memory specifically for chess positions that could occur in a real game."
The terms he's referring to, chunking of information in long-term memory, comes from cognitive psychology. He references studies from 1973 and 1979 that found experts have chunks grouped information together, making memory easier. A more recent study from 1998 found that experts have larger chunks for real game positions, not random games. Similar to Magnus earlier, the Harry Potter game position was not chunked, linked in his memory as well as the other positions. Working memory is also a concept used in this approach, which a 1996 study found if during the recall process participants were asked to do something that used working memory, they perform worse. Distractions get in the way. So what we have are characteristics of what an expert might be, as Derek doesn't actually say what an expert is in his video. Someone, when compared to others, in a particular context, perform better during a specific process, without certain distractions because of their superior memory. The pi guy is an expert in remembering numbers of pi, when compared to the majority of the population, not an expert in using pi. I imagine he knows a bit considering his interest and the number, but mathematicians and physicists will probably be better than him at using pi in different contexts, so his expert status is grounded in a context. Derek then says,
"At its core, expertise is about recognition."
Which bugged me a little bit. If being an expert means recognizing things in long-term memory, what about understanding? In a previous review, I explored understanding. We can understand something but not know why. Our rationale or reason, due to shallow understanding, could be wrong, leading to a rational error, a term from the meta-ignorance literature, making wrong decisions because we think we understand something when we actually don't. Or we can understand something at a greater depth, grasping more connections between different ideas and knowledge, giving us a clearer rationale, leading us to make more effective decisions. I can recognize a chess position just like Magnus and have an understanding where the pieces are, but his greater depth of understanding can lead to better performance. Maybe Derek had deep understanding as part of his meaning behind recognition, I don't know. I have this review scheduled to be released soon, which suggests this idea of deeper understanding through co-instantaneous mental coordination, or linking of ideas, through mental modeling, deliberately grouping ideas together, and the use of neuronal packets, or chunks of information, for deeper understanding. So I would say being an expert is not just about recognition of long-term memories, but the deeper understanding or connections in the long-term memories being used. The quality of information in the chunks is also important. Magnus recognizes more information because of the larger chunks, neuronal packets, but has more expertise due to the deeper understanding of the information in those chunks, when compared to me or other people. Having said that,
and recognition leads directly to intuition.
So intuition is from System 1, as stated in Derek's previous video, using long-term memory to make responses. But if that is from recognition, then recognition must also be, in some sense, unconscious. An example that comes to mind from a podcast I listened to recently was Juan Fangio, who slowed down in an F1 race because of a crash they hadn't seen yet. Afterwards, he realised it was that the faces in the crowd weren't looking at him. Why and where he slowed down is obviously up for debate, but the concept of direct perception comes to mind. He acted before recognising why, something I explored in a video about ecological dynamics. I'm going to assume Derek has used recognition because of his reference to a different chess study, finding that time constraints affected experts less because of their either instantaneous or unconscious computations, thinking. But when we look at the definition of recognition, we identify or acknowledge something, which requires conscious thought, whereas intuition is acting without conscious thought. So how does a longer conscious process, recognition, lead to an unconscious decision, intuition, when the intuition is quicker than the conscious process? Somehow we have acted before we have decided to act. This discussion goes beyond expertise, but is worth considering as it forms part of his rationale. This sounds to me like Derek is suggesting experts use long-term memories without thinking about it, intuitively, to make better performance decisions. But we can be right from our intuition and not have expertise. I think it is when the intuition is repeatedly accurate over time, not just a one-off, as I explored in the expertise effectiveness debate in coaching. To me, it is not the intuition, it is where the intuition comes from, which, in Derek's explanation, would be long-term memory. He then goes on to say,
10,000 hours of practice by itself is not sufficient. There are 4 additional criteria that must be met. And in areas where these criteria aren't met, it's impossible to become an expert.
Now, I know it is a YouTube video, so maybe a bit of drama is necessary, but impossible? I'm not sure on that unless the criteria are broad, which I think they are, so he doesn't lie, but I don't think the criteria are as useful as they could be. Repeated attempts sounds like practice. Not a type of practice, blocked, serial, random, constant, or variable, just practice. Feedback can't really be avoided either. You see the result, feel the movement, learn the answer. He uses an example study where people try to predict a result, a one-off event, and says,
even in the areas they knew best, experts were not significantly better than non-specialists.
But as he said, they were one-off events, and from the characteristics of an expert we just went through, they don't have chunks of information in long-term memory about that context. So they weren't experts in those questions, they were experts in a different context. In the meta-ignorance literature, there is a term read-around knowledge, which is what these experts would be doing, trying to use what they know to get to the best answer they can, which predictably means they were no more accurate than the others using their read-around knowledge, with Derek concluding,
so we should be wary of experts who don't have repeated experience with feedback.
But what I hear there is listen to experts from the context the questions are in, which is kind of obvious. I wouldn't ask a builder how to write an academic paper. I mean, maybe there is someone out there that could do that, but you see my point. Practice and feedback, sure, it is useful, but what sort of practice and what sort of feedback? This doesn't seem to add to the 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. It is part of deliberate practice.
The next requirement is a valid environment, one that contains regularities that make it at least somewhat predictable.
A valid environment to me is one that represents the thing you want to learn. I would use a football to learn football and a dart to learn darts, but in the video, Derek talks about predictable results from the environment, saying stocks are a low valid environment because the movements are almost entirely random, adding that you could get lucky. But looking at the practice we are doing in the environment, because that is what we do to become an expert, the unpredictable results can become predictable by constraining the environment. Warren Buffett is used as an expert example who picks the environment that will get predictable results. Inside of the skill acquisition research, these unpredictable results from the environment are variations in movement, which is actually what we want. Not the unpredictability, but the variations, which is why variable practice, repetition without repetition, is so useful. Becoming an expert in a context requires defining an environment and doing ecologically valid practice, practicing the actual skill. As a beginner, that environment may be constrained to reduce the unpredictability until the person increases in performance, then removing constraints. I don't know the stock market, so I can't think of an example in there, but when you learn a new skill, there are lots of unknowns, and unknown unknowns making results hard to predict, leading me to think that a valid environment means an environment where the difficulty, complexity, isn't too much for the individual performing. In other words, practice can't be too hard. Sure, but how do you work that out?
But the vast majority of stock pickers and active investment managers do not demonstrate expert performance because of the low validity of their environment.
Which to me means they can't organize all of the information, which makes sense because there is way too much going on. But when they look at manageable environments, constrained environments, they find success. Otherwise, there wouldn't be jobs because of the random success rate. But I'm just guessing there. A small note here. The majority won't demonstrate expert performance because experts are better than the majority, which is why they're called experts. Just a thought. A paper referenced and study spoken about was about looking for patterns, but we still try and predict things against the odds, reducing our performance. This was a rationale for why people try and beat the system or try and do things they are not necessarily that good at. That is one good explanation. One I lean more towards, though, is the Dunning-Kruger effect. As they don't know what they don't know, they try and perform like an expert without knowing how.
Even when there are patterns, you need timely feedback in order to learn them.
On the face of it, I thought this might go into some more detail about the feedback somewhat skipped over in the first criteria, but instead it covers immediate and delayed feedback, focusing on the negative of delayed feedback, which confused me because in his thesis, which I went through, he looks at the cognitive load theory and discusses how we need to think to learn and challenge misconceptions, which, if given immediate feedback, can take away that opportunity. An educator giving the answers can stop the learner from thinking. He knows the timing of feedback depends on the intended response for the educator. Both immediate and delayed feedback help. Maybe it was cut from the video again, I don't know. He then goes on to talk about predictions of performance. The paper reference talks about using stats to help predictions to reduce bias and human error, but I am lost with how predicting performance is so tied in with delayed feedback. Looking at talent identification, the relative age effect, early specialization versus early diversification, developmental models alongside biological, sociological, emotional, and cognitive maturity of individuals with their prior experience and expertise in the context, all impacting performance predictions, which is obviously much more than feedback, although feedback is a factor. Back to the timely feedback, when is feedback effective or not? What type of feedback should be given and kept back? Positive, negative, intrinsically focused, extrinsically focused, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, after the session, during the action, after the event. There was no specifics. I know each learning environment is different, but I was expecting something, because feedback again is just part of deliberate practice, not a separate criteria. I feel like the point about experts judging an application is also a bit odd. What is the person judging the application an expert in? Matching criteria to a submission? Speed reading applications? I'm not sure where the point was going. I know he says,
so it's comforting to know that the gatekeepers at these institutions aren't great predictors of future success.
But when I think about what they are looking for, they don't have all the information to predict success. Motivation, characteristics, or knowledge of the future. So they are bad at something they don't have the information to do. The point I'm getting at is they are not necessarily experts judging you. They are experienced people. And we know experience is different from expertise, which is different from being an expert. The fourth criteria is to not get comfortable, or in other words, push the boundaries.
Now, I have played guitar for 25 years, but I'm not an expert because I usually play the same songs. It's easier and more fun. But in order to learn, you have to be practicing at the edge of your ability.
But I disagree. I think Derek could be an expert in playing some of those songs, because other players won't know them as well. They would need to learn the song, and his long-term memory may have more connections. But he is not an expert as a guitar player, because that is a more broad or complex environment. So being an expert in a broader environment means pushing your learning, pushing your expertise to other contexts, expanding what you're an expert in, naming numbers of pi and using pi in math. He then goes on to talk about deliberate practice.
Doctors with 20 years experience were actually worse at diagnosing them than recent graduates, and that's because they haven't thought about those rare diseases in a long time.
And the paper talks about how you can lose expertise without practice and gain expertise with practice. But deliberate practice is what we started with, the 10,000 hours. So the fourth criteria also seems to be part of the deliberate practice.
And this is why coaches and teachers are so valuable. They can recognize your weaknesses and assign tasks to address them.
But deliberate practice is only a very small part of what coaches and teachers do to alter practice. What about deliberate play, structured play, or playful experiences? Those hours used to learn are not all deliberate practice, and there are different definitions of what deliberate practice is and what it looks like. Not to mention, you can deliberately practice something but transfer the skill to something else.
When those criteria are met, human performance is astonishing. And when it's not, you get people we think of as experts who actually aren't.
Going back to the original impossible point, you won't become an expert if you don't practice lots with feedback in an appropriate environment. I don't disagree, but that leaves me with questions like what makes the practice effective? What feedback is effective? what environment is beneficial? And then the other side, what is ineffective practice, ineffective feedback, and ineffective environment? Apart from stating a couple of characteristics of one definition of deliberate practice, I'm not sure what the added criteria is. I know those questions are nuanced and encompass much of the educational science literature, looking at skill acquisition, psychology, anatomy and physiology, biomechanics, epistemology, pedagogy, andragogy, and all the other ologies. But Derek, I wanted more. Every educator will have a different philosophy of practice based on various evidence, but I don't know what philosophy is being encouraged with the video, which I think could lead to confirmation of preconceived notions about practice that are not supported by science, and potentially misconceptions about educators and all that they do. I don't think you would encourage coaches to punish a 5-year-old for making a mistake and get them running laps around a pitch, but I don't see anything in the video that says you shouldn't do it. Just some of my initial thoughts when watching the video. Is only been out for a couple of days, so but what do you think?